All right, I want to welcome you all to Pastor's Point of View number 186. Today is November the 12th, 2021, and we're kind of continuing on where we left off last time in Pastor's Point of View number 185. We were giving you a prophecy update, and we've covered Israel, New World Order religion, New World Order location, global crisis management, and we ended last time with tech tyranny. And let's pick it up here with the gender surrender. Of course, when we talk about the gender surrender, we want to think about the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 27, where God, the author of sexuality, on the very first page of his book, the Bible, says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So when you read passages like this, you start to understand why the progressive left hates the Bible so much, because it goes directly against the mindset that they have that sexuality is trans, or essentially whatever you make it out to be or whatever you want it to be. And we would look at it as a rebellion against God himself, because God only created two genders. It's also why one of the great battles that's gone on probably since Darwin is taking Genesis 1 through 11 literally or non-literally. There's a giant voice today, even within the Christian world, trying to argue that Genesis 1 through 11 is not narrative history, and it really doesn't mean what it says. And so they want to debate whether Adam was a historical figure, whether the flood covered the earth, whether the creation days are 24-hour days, and those kinds of subjects. And so if we get clear on Genesis 1 through 11, suddenly the whole concept of gender becomes very, very clear, because God only created two genders. Now, as America descends into moral insanity and moral oblivion, it's very interesting to note that God and his outworkings of life are being attacked at every fundamental level, including the issue of gender itself. Whether there are really two genders or not is under vicious attack today. And notice right here from our own State Department, this is right off their website, it says, issuance of the first U.S. passport with an X gender marker. And this post went up, I believe, October 27th, 2021. And notice what our own State Department says here. Quote, the Department of State continues the process of updating its policies regarding gender markers on U.S. passports and consular reports of birth abroad, otherwise known as CRBAs, to better serve all citizens regardless of their gender identity. As the Secretary announced in June, the Department is moving towards adding an X gender marker for non-binary, intersex, and gender non-conforming persons applying for a U.S. passport or a CRBA. So right down to official proclamations from our own government. I mean, this is not coming from somebody with a kooky website or some left-leaning professor somewhere. It's coming from our own State Department, and now our own State Department, thanks to the current administration, is in the process of creating brand new passports where you no longer have to identify as either a male or a female. And this gender surrender war, as I like to call it, is so fundamental. It's getting down to Halloween costumes and what Halloween costumes the kids are allowed to wear or not wear. We have just emerged from celebrating Halloween, as many people across the nation have done. And it's interesting that even with the selection of Halloween costumes, the gender surrender war gets right into that issue. So here I'm quoting from an article by Breitbart. The title of it is the ADLU, that stands for the Anti-Defamation League, warns to avoid culturally insensitive, gender-conforming Halloween costumes. This is by Paul Boyce, October the 24th, 2021. Notice what the article says. It says the increasingly partisan ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, interjected itself into the annual Halloween debate this week when the organization advised parents to avoid Halloween costumes that are culturally insensitive and perpetuate gender norms. They say, or they go on to say, the ADLU also cautioned against costumes that offend people of lower economic status, like hobos, bums, or rednecks, addressing teachers whose gender non-conforming students might feel ashamed in the presence of such gender-specific costumes. The ADLU suggested schools tell the students that there aren't boys and girls costumes. So even the idea that there are certain costumes for boys and certain costumes for girls is now under attack. So welcome to the new norm, which is the whole gender surrender mindset. Antonio Gramsci basically said the way to get a civilization to unravel is you have to infiltrate the parts of that civilization that disseminate values and thought. So you go after academia, you go after the centers of cultural influence, and you shift their thinking. And this is right out of the Gramsci playbook, where passports being rewritten, that's at the governmental level. But this sort of intention by the ADL to influence Halloween costumes, that's now at the cultural level. And we're living now in this Romans 1 environment. Read Romans 1, verses 18 through 32, and you'll see an outworking of what we're talking about here in terms of the gender surrender. When man rejects a knowledge of God as he is revealed in creation and suppresses God, man then becomes confused about sexuality and relationships, since God is the author of those relationships. If you reject God, you have no capacity to understand how sexuality is supposed to operate under God's blueprint. And this is the ramifications of a culture that rejects God. And that's where we are today in the United States. And I wanted to bring this to your attention as we are doing today this prophecy and cultural update. Let's move on, if we could, into our next category, which is the transitioning that's happening in the United States in terms of our economy from a free market-based economy into either a socialist and ultimately a Marxist, government-controlled, government-planned economy, which always involves the redistribution of wealth by government power. And that's exactly what's happening here in the United States. The greatest economy that has given more people more economic and political freedom than any other economic system on the face of the earth, and has, as the saying goes, a rising tide affects all boats, is now under great attack as we're now descending into more of a Marxist, communist style of economics. And it is true that Marxism does make us all equal at the end of the day. It just makes us equally poor. And everywhere Marxism has been tried, the result is always the same. And now the United States of America is being transitioned into that type of economic system. It's happening slowly, it's happening gradually, but it's happening nonetheless. And so notice, if you will, this article from Breitbart. The title of it is Biden's Treasury Adds a Counselor to Address Alleged Systemic Racism in the Economy. And this was written by Penny Starr, October the 26th, 2021. Notice what the article says. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said on Monday that Janice Bowdler, if I'm pronouncing that right, a former J.P. Morgan Chase executive, is part of a multi-pronged strategy by the Biden administration to deal with systemic racism found in many parts of the economy, the Associated Press reported. Treasury, Yellen said, must play a central role in ensuring that our economy recovers from the pandemic, or as it recovers from the pandemic, it also recovers in a way that addresses the inequalities that existed long before anyone was infected with COVID-19, Yellen said in a statement. So I want you to understand something, that somebody in the Treasury Department has been appointed to a particular role in terms of a counselor, and that particular role involves analyzing our economy from a critical race theory perspective. Now, we have covered in prior shows what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is really nothing more than Marxism. Even before I explain that, look at this tweet here by Secretary Janet Yellen. She says, I've appointed Janice Bowdler to serve as Treasury's first counselor for racial equity, charged with coordinating Treasury's efforts to advance racial equity, including identifying and mitigating barriers to accessing benefits and opportunities with the department. Notice, by the way, the repetition of this term equity. It's not what they're promoting simply equality of opportunity, which we're all in favor of. What they're actually promoting is equality or equity in terms of how everyone will end up, regardless of thrift, ingenuity, determination, level of gifting, etc., etc. So when the government starts to micromanage not simply equality of opportunity, but equality of results, which is what they mean by this word equity, it's nothing short of interjecting Marxism into the economy. And of course, they feel they're justified in doing this because of critical race theory. And you'll notice when we've covered critical race theory, we've been very clear that critical race theory is simply a theory about race relations that's masquerading as Marxism or communism. Notice this book by James Cone. James Cone, a theologian. It's interesting how a lot of these things are being developed at the theological level. James Cone influenced a man theologically named the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who I affectionately call as the Reverend Jeremiah Wrong. But Jeremiah Wright was basically a critical race theory advocate, and he influenced a man who sat in his church for 20 years by the name of Barack Hussein Obama, who eventually became the President of the United States, as you know. So this whole thing trickles down from James Cone, this critical race theory. And look at the title of his book. It's entitled The Black Church and Marxism. Those aren't my words, those are his words. The Black Church and Marxism, what do they have to say to each other? By theologian James Cone. So critical race theory is just a code word for Marxism. And when Yellen appoints someone to examine our economy from the perspective of critical race theory using this language of equity, not equality of opportunity, but equality of results, that's a clear sign that there are those within our society, our government, in positions of leadership that are somehow dissatisfied with the free market system that we have, which has positively influenced the lives of more people than any economic system in the history of man. They want to tear it down and they want to replace it with a Marxist model. I believe a lot of this is preparatory for what the book of Revelation describes prophetically. Notice Revelation 13, 16 through 18, some verses you no doubt know very well because we frequently make reference to these. It talks about the beast's system of the last days. And it says, he causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, and he provides that no one will be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. So Bible prophecy tells us that the day will arise when this system will be the norm. And I would just ask you a very simple question. Is this system that will arise one day at the hands of the Antichrist, does it have more to do with free market capitalism, or does it have more to do with communism or Marxism, where the state controls your life literally from cradle to grave? I would say this system looks a lot more similar to me to Marxism than it does the free market. So the interjection of critical race theory into our leadership, our current leadership, as we're looking at economic recovery from the pandemic, or better said, the plandemic, is moving the United States away from its free market foundation and into Marxism in preparation for Bible prophecy ultimately to be fulfilled. Let's move on to our second to last category here, and this has to do with re-education. Could the day in history in the United States actually arrive where people who don't think the right way, people who are politically incorrect, will actually be forced into re-education camps? They won't call it that, of course. They'll have a much nicer name for it. Re-education facilities designed to help the mentally ill, something along those lines, where people will actually be forced into those facilities to change their value system, to make their individual value system more harmonious with the New World Order that they want to bring upon us. I don't think that day is that far away, quite frankly. And one of the reasons I say that is because of this particular article here from ZeroHedge.com. It says CDC, that's the Center for Disease Control, CDC director recently said or indicated that unvaccinated police and government workers. Now, let me just stop right there. Who are these people? These are people that don't like the fact that they're being forced by governmental authorities, whether they're firemen, policemen, first responders. This is happening in New York. It's happening a lot of places. They don't like the fact that they're having to choose between the job and the jab, and they're rebelling. And so here comes the CDC director, interviewed by Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday, indicating that unvaccinated police and government workers are to be sent for, quote, her words, not mine, education and counseling, close quote. This was dated October the 26th, and it was authored by Steve Watson of Summit News. And let's read a little bit of that article if we could. It says, appearing on Fox News Sunday, the CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, declared that the Biden administration is planning to provide vaccine-hesitant police and other government workers with, her words, quote, education and counseling to make them, quote, her words, comfortable, close quote, with taking the jab. Here's the direct quote from Walensky. There is a plan, should these people not want to be jabbed, towards education and counseling to get people the information they need so that they are feeling comfortable in getting the jab, Walensky declared. Now, what is that? That is nothing short of Marxist-style re-education under coercion. You don't think the right way, you don't have the right value system, so we need to, by the way, all at taxpayer expense, put you into some kind of program or some kind of environment to reprogram you. Marxists have been doing this from time immemorial. This is how they take people and put them through this intense propaganda to change their value system. And the ones that are very, very strong in their value system, like, for example, the evangelical, born-again, Bible-believing Christian, people that won't budge, well, those are people that are simply need to be eliminated. They need to be sent to Siberia or whatnot. And so it does disturb me a great deal to learn that the head of the CDC, again, not someone with a kooky website, not some left-leaning professor at some obscure university, but the head of the CDC is using the expression, quote, education and counseling, close quote, to get people to feel more, quote, comfortable, close quote, with the agenda the state wants to bring in. And, may the good Lord help us to understand of the time period that we're living in. Let's move to our last and final category that we're looking at in these two sessions. PPOV number 180, let's see, we are in number 186 here, and then this is part 2 from 185. But let's look at our last area here, and it has to do with our disintegrating Constitution. Constitutional protections, constitutional rights. Doesn't the United States Constitution protect its citizens from these encroachments of big government that we have been articulating? Well, apparently not. People are making very, very broad and very, very bold statements, and it's almost as if they're thinking and acting as if the Constitution doesn't exist at all, and our unalienable rights coming from God himself don't exist either. And you have to pay attention to what thinkers are publicly proclaiming. Key cultural philosophers. I pay attention very carefully to their words because their words ultimately will lead to actions and to government policy. And so we have this particular article here from Noam Chomsky, and it's entitled, "The Unvaccinated Should Be Isolated," those are his direct words, "isolated from society." This is by Paul Boyce, October the 25th, 2021, from Breitbart. And it says here, famed MIT linguist, in other words, this gentleman, Noam Chomsky, is a key philosopher of the day. Famed MIT linguist, professor, and far-left activist Noam Chomsky believes that while people who refuse vaccines should not be enforced to inject one, they should still be isolated to protect the community. So he says, yeah, you're free to turn the jab down. I'm glad he at least said that. But we need to take you and put you in a place where you are kind of like almost in a leper's colony, and you're isolated from the rest of the world. So here is a direct quote from Chomsky. He says, quote, "People who refuse to accept the jab, I think the right response for them is not to force them, but rather to insist that they be isolated." isolation facilities, in other words. They be isolated. If people decide I'm willing to be a danger to the community by refusing the jab, then they should say to them, well, I have the decency to isolate myself. I don't want a jab, but I don't have the right to run around harming people. That should be the convention. Close quote. In other words, we should create a social convention where we take people who, are uninterested in receiving the jab for whatever reason, and we should take them and we should isolate them from the rest of us. This particular article goes on and it says Chomsky did not address the fact that the jab does not stop transmission of the virus, nor did he address whether or not a person who previously recovered from the virus, natural immunity, for example, has the right to refuse the jab. Now, it's not just Noam Chomsky who's saying things like this. This is actually coming from the mouth and the lips of people like Alan Dershowitz, people who think Alan Dershowitz, famous Harvard law professor, they think he's a conservative. And actually, Alan Dershowitz is saying the exact same thing that Noam Chomsky is saying. The article brings up Alan Dershowitz and something Alan Dershowitz told a podcast host, Jason Goodman, back in 2020. This is what Dershowitz said, quote, "You have no constitutional right to endanger the public and spread the disease, even if you disagree. You have no right not to be jabbed or vaccinated. You have no right not to wear a mask. You have no right to open up your business," close quote. This is a constitutional authority, supposedly. This is a constitutional scholar, supposedly. I mean, this guy is on every single cable outlet in the country, if not the world, constantly pontificating about his views concerning the Constitution. And what he's saying is the Constitution no longer exists in this area. The Constitution no longer protects you. And so that's why I've called this entire category here that we're discussing the end of constitutional protections. It's interesting that I ran into this article from MSNBC.com, dated October 10th, 2021. A very recent article written by Jessica Levinson, who's an MSNBC opinion columnist. The title of the article is "COVID Vaccine Religious Exemptions Should Not Exist." Here's why. The law defending religious exemption for vaccine mandates doesn't exist. When it comes to vaccine mandates, there's no constitutional defense for religious objections. And this is her conclusion in her article. Quote, "The law allows for vaccine requirements without religious exemptions. Not only that, but morality mandates it." So notice this, leftist morality, their understanding of morality trumps the Constitution. She goes on and she says, therefore, we should abolish religious exemptions for these mandates. The fact of the matter is there is a religious exemption for people that don't want to submit to the jab. I can lay it out for you very clearly right now. I, as a pastor, write many, many exemption letters for people in our flock, either members at Sugarland Bible Church or regular attenders that are facing this issue of the job or the jab. And I think there is a constitutional right for such an exemption. If you don't want to be jabbed, you're within your constitutional rights to not be jabbed. And we had our letter very carefully crafted and overlooked by in-house counsel. Some key attorneys took a look at it, And they said that we are exactly on the right path with our religious exemption letter. Let me lay out the case for it. First of all, before I lay out the case for it, let's not forget what the First Amendment says. Remember the First Amendment? No one quotes the First Amendment anymore. Have you noticed that? They quote Chomsky. They quote Alan Dershowitz. They quote Miss Levinson. But what does the Constitution actually say? As it's giving us rights that man can't take away because they come from God himself, according to our own national birth certificate, the Declaration of Independence. What does it say? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or, look at this next part, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Close quote. In other words, the government can't get into the business of inhibiting people on the basis of getting them to do things or not do things when it contradicts their religion. Now, what part of that is hard to understand? I mean, Alan Dershowitz is a constitutional scholar. No doubt he's read the First Amendment. Levinson is an MSNBC columnist. No doubt she's read the First Amendment. Chomsky is a scholar as well, an MIT linguist. No doubt he's read the First Amendment. But they're all just acting as if the First Amendment doesn't even exist. Let's take people and round them up and re-educate them and put them in isolation facilities or re-education camps. It doesn't matter what their religious beliefs are. They have no right to receive a religious exemption. Whatever happened to the First Amendment? It's almost as if someone is waving a magic wand and the First Amendment no longer exists. So is there a religious exemption? If you don't want to receive the jab and you're having to choose between what the government wants you to do, receive the jab and your own religious freedoms, is there actually a case that can be made? Well, of course there's a case that can be made. It has to do with these simple words: be fruitful and multiply. God says that in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, which means God is not in favor of the depopulation agenda. The depopulation agenda, where you have an ambition to shrink the population of the world under some, phony theory of we need to do this for global warming or climate change or whatever the issue is. God is not in favor of that. And the vaccination itself, it can be reasonably argued, is part of the depopulation agenda. Now, why do I think that? How could I make such a bold statement? Well, look at what shows up here on the screen. This is an article concerning Bill Gates and comments he made at a gathering back in 2010. And the title of it is Bill Gates says, quote, "We need vaccines to reduce the population." I mean, those aren't my words. Those are his words. And this article goes on, and it's a little blurry, so I'm going to try to read a little bit of it to you. But it says, Gates made his remarks to the invitation-only Long Beach, California, TED 2010 conference. So this is well over a decade ago. In a speech entitled Innovating to Zero. Along with, and this is some commentary, some scientifically absurd proposition of reducing man-made CO2 emissions worldwide to zero by 2050. Approximately 4.5 minutes into the task, Gates declared, quote, "First, we got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people in it." Now keep in mind he said that back in 2010. Now that the population of the world is rapidly approaching the 8 billion mark, he's probably more hot under the collar about the issue than he was back then. He says that's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we lower that. I can't believe he's actually saying this in public. We lower that by perhaps 10 to 15%, close quote. We got too many people in the world. So we need, what does he say here? More abortion. But we also need, and these aren't my words, these are his words, we also need vaccines. Bill Gates, when you look at his family tree and his parents and so forth, what you'll find in that family tree is the origin of Planned Parenthood, which is an organization started by Margaret Sanger, who was one of the most racist people that have ever walked the face of the earth. And she stated that blacks are nothing more than weeds. And she stated that we have to lower the population of the black community. That's why when you go all around the country and you look at Planned Parenthood facilities, they're typically located in black neighborhoods and black communities. We've got one of the biggest Planned Parenthood facilities probably in the world here in Houston, and part of course, there it is, right there in neighborhoods that are primarily and predominantly black. Now, how come critical race theory people never bring that up? They never bring up that issue. And Bill Gates himself says we need these vaccines to decrease the population. So are you telling me there's no religious exemption to receiving a vaccine when the progenitor of the whole thing says the vaccine is necessary to depopulate the human race, particularly the black race, and God on page 1 of his book says be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it? How could a Christian in their right mind cooperate with this agenda? And Levinson and Chomsky and Alan Dershowitz are all arguing that the free exercise clause of the First Amendment doesn't protect people here. Well, of course it does. Beyond that, when you look at the whole subject of the jab, let's quit using the language vaccine. This is not a vaccine. This is an experimental drug. And how do we know this is an experimental drug? We know this is an experimental drug because a true vaccine requires time to ascertain if side effects are going to show up. Somebody tell me what time has been allowed to elapse to determine side effects when we're moving now under what's called Operation Warp Speed. And people say, well, you're anti-vax. No, I'm not. I've had vaccines myself on different issues. Even my own child has received vaccines on certain issues. So I'm not anti-vax. I'm anti this vax, which is not a vax. It's an experimental drug. And by the way, this is what the Nazis were doing to people, and that's why we have the Nuremberg ruling. The Nuremberg ruling is you can't, based on international law, force people against their will to receive an experimental drug. And you're going to tell me that people that don't want to take this have no religious grounds for doing so? The fact of the matter is 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 19 says, or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? You were bought with a price. It goes on and it says, therefore honor and glorify God in your body. So if you are forcing me against my will to take something that's really not a vaccine, but rather an experimental drug, whose side effects haven't even been determined yet because we don't have enough time yet to ascertain whether side effects are going to develop, are you not violating my religious rights? I have an obligation as a Christian to treat my body properly and with respect because the Holy Spirit lives inside of my body. And so it's quite clear when you look at it from that angle that a religious exemption should exist. Beyond that, and I'm not a medical authority, but I do listen to people that are. I listen to Dr. Simone Gold. I listen to Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, and there are countless others that I listen to who will tell you very clearly that this so-called vaccine or this experimental drug was created through the cell lines of aborted, tissues of aborted fetuses. I remember this. I remember when Planned Parenthood was caught on film at a restaurant just casually talking about body parts and talking about how much money they can make, by shipping this body part from an aborted baby over here or this organ from an aborted baby over there. And when people saw that live on camera, it outraged them. Have you ever asked this question? What do they want these organs for? Could it be to create this so-called vaccine? So if you force me to take this vaccine, you are forcing me to contribute to the whole process of abortion. And that goes against what God says. The Bible is not pro-abortion. In fact, Genesis 25 and verse 23, God says let's see, I think this would be Rebecca. He says, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. Excuse me, I think he's saying that to Rachel. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. And one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. God made that determination about Jacob and Esau while they were within their mother's womb. In fact, it says here, 2 nations are in your womb. Now, that's just one of many Bible verses I could show you on the subject of abortion. Countless verses. But it's quite clear that the Bible is pro-life. So if you're forcing people against their religious objection to receive this experimental drug, which has been created through the cell lines of aborted tissues and aborted fetuses and all of that kind of thing, you're doing something that goes against what God said. So this is not a complicated issue. As I've tried to lay out as clearly as I can, related to the depopulation agenda, related to potential harm to your body, which is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and related to abortion, that a religious exemption should exist, and yet these constitutional scholars and constitutional authorities are acting as if there is no such thing as a religious exemption. And you also have coming on the scene people under the guise of Christianity, false teachers, I would call them, telling people the Christian thing to do is to receive this experimental drug into your body, despite the things that I've said earlier. So one such false teacher is a man named John Piper. And you'll notice the title of his article dated October 19th, 2021. He says, a reason to be vaccinated is freedom. And listen to this twisted logic. He says, my aim in this article is to encourage Christians to be vaccinated. Now, he's encouraging them in spite of the pro-abortion underpinnings of the drug, in spite of the depopulation agenda behind the drug, and in spite of the harmful side effects that can show up in one's body because of the drug. He thinks it's the Christian duty to go ahead and receive this experimental drug into your body. My aim in this article is to encourage Christians to be vaccinated, if they can do so with a good conscience and judicial medical warrant. The people I have especially in view are those who are not vaccinated because of fear of being out of step with people they respect and in step with people that they don't admire. My message to them is simple: you are free, but woe to us Christians if this radical freedom makes us cocky. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil. He's quoting here 1 Peter 2, verse 16. And the greatest evil is the pride of self-exaltation. Your conscience is increasingly clear. It says get vaccinated. But there is this nagging fear of looking left-wing or progressive or democratic or compromised or woke. So my message to folks is this: the children are free. Close quote. What a I don't know where to start with this. It's so the logic is so twisted. Notice how he's quoting the Bible. People today, for whatever reason, are so impressed with someone quoting the Bible. I'm not impressed with people that quote the Bible because Satan quotes the Bible. You say, well, where does Satan do that? He does it in Luke 4, verses 9 through 11, where Satan said to Jesus, and he, that's Satan, led him, that's Jesus, to Jerusalem and had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple and said, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you, and on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Close quote. There the devil is quoting Psalm 91, verses 11 and 12, to convince Christ to throw himself from the pinnacle of the temple. The only problem is he's taking Psalm 91, verses 11 and 12 out of context and challenging him to intentionally put himself in harm's way to see if God is going to actually come through for him and protect him, which is not what Psalm 91 verses 11 and 12 is about. That's how I feel when John Piper is quoting 1 Peter 2 verse 16. Piper is saying, hey, you're free from fear, forget the stereotypes and go ahead and get the jab, as if that's even the issue. I mean, why doesn't Piper write an article or give a speech or give a sermon on why you don't have to obey the government when the government says do A and God says do B? I mean, how come he doesn't write that kind of blog article? No, he wants to take 1 Peter 2 verse 16, mutilate its context, and make it sound like the reason people don't want the jab is they're caving to peer pressure from their conservative friends. And basically the exact opposite is true. I mean, talk about missing the point, whoosh, going right out over your head. He doesn't even deal with the issue. The issue is the government is coercing people through these mandates to do things that they feel violate their conscience as a Christian, and I've laid out that case earlier. And so we're living in this time period where the Constitution is basically being set aside. Not only is the Constitution being set aside in the United States, basic inalienable rights are being set aside all over the world. Look no farther than this article from thenewamerican.com by Michael Tennant, October 20th, 2021, Canadian pastor. Now you remember this gentleman, last name is Pawlowski. He's the one that returned, he's very anti these mandates. He returned to Canada and was promptly arrested for it. The title of this article is Canadian Pastor Ordered, listen to this very carefully, ordered to read disclaimer when speaking against COVID-19 mandates. This judge has ruled if you ever open your mouth as a pastor in a church in Canada from your own pulpit, and you say something about the mandates, we're going to control your speech. Now, if that's not the death of the First Amendment, I don't know what is. Of course, this is Canada, it's not the United States, but I thought unalienable rights should be respected around the world. They're not being respected in the jurisdiction of our northern neighbor, Canada. A little bit from the article. Whenever he speaks out against COVID-19 mandates, he, that's Pawlowski, must also read a disclaimer stating that his views do not align with those of the medical experts. Alberta Justice Adam Germain, that's the so-called judge or justice that wrote this decision. In my opinion, this man is not a justice or a judge or the enforcer of the law, which is what a judge is supposed to be doing. He is an activist masquerading as a judge. According to this particular judge, his last name is Germain, quote, whenever they are opposing the health orders in any forum, they must also place the other side of the argument on the record. And here's what Mr. Pastor Pawlowski is required to read now in his sermons whenever he addresses this issue. Quote, I am also aware that the views I am expressing to you on this occasion may not be views held by the majority of medical experts in Alberta. While I may disagree with them, I am obliged to inform you that the majority of medical experts favor social distancing, mask wearing, and avoiding large crowds to reduce the spread of COVID-19. Most medical experts also support participation in a vaccination program unless for a valid religious or medical reasons you cannot be vaccinated. Vaccinations have been shown statistically to save lives and to reduce the severity of COVID-19 symptoms, close quote. So every time Pawlowski speaks on the issue from his pulpit in his church, he's got to read this disclaimer. This particular article, I like what it says. It goes on and it says there was no word on whether Germain intended to impose a similar mandate for even-handedness on anyone speaking in favor of COVID-19 restrictions or vaccines. Well, what about the pastor that speaks in favor of the vaccines? Does he have to give a countervailing perspective? Oh, not addressed in the judge's opinion. Surprise, surprise. The article goes on and says Germain, that's the judge, is hardly an unbiased arbiter. Here's some other things that he says in his decision. The mandates are designed to protect people. He claimed that Pawlowski had contributed to his omnibus health situation, or contributed to this omnibus health situation by their defiance of the health rules and the public posturing. This judge goes on and says everyone who follows the science on COVID-19, in other words, Pawlowski is out of step with science. He goes on and he says they're on the wrong side of science, history, and common sense. And there's a wonderful parenthetical break that the authors of this article provide, where they say, or the author of this article provides, where he says, there are, of course, mountains of evidence to suggest that those pushing the virus so-called mitigation strategies, including vaccines, are on the wrong side of science, close quote. But that side of the argument is totally ignored in Germain's biased, activist opinion, written opinion. Germain wrote that the health orders are, quote, are all intrusions of personal liberty. They are not sacrifices that would offend the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that they are not egregious sacrifices. In other words, the Canadian Charter of Rights won't protect Pawlowski here, is what he's saying. He goes on and he makes references to the health order enforcers as Nazis. That's what Pawlowski said. And Germain chimes in, of course, that was inappropriate. The perspective of the judge, or the opinion, goes on and it says, to impact and influence the behavior of others who choose to flaunt court orders. That's his attitude towards Pawlowski, not a man who's exercising his free speech rights. And then it's very clear, the writers of the article say, it's obvious this judge or jurist wanted to make an example out of Pulowski. Well, what does Pulowski, the pastor, say about this? Here's his quote. Pulowski quipped after leaving the court last week, quote, "Now every time I open my mouth to the public," he said, "I have to lie," stating that vaccinations are saving lives, that masks work, that doctors and scientists are all for the restrictions, close quote. In other words, you have a situation in Canada where a pastor behind a pulpit preaching a sermon, when he deals with a certain subject, is forced to lie. Now, as a pastor myself and as a preacher myself, this is scary. I mean, these people are acting as if free speech means absolutely nothing. I mean, is the government going to send us the manuscripts for our sermons in advance, that we're supposed to preach? Whatever happened to our calling from God above to declare unto God's people the whole counsel of God's word? Now we're in a situation in Canada where the government is interfering with this pastor's ability to do what God has called him to do, our vanishing constitutional freedoms. And let me end with this. This comes from the Houston Chronicle, otherwise known as the Houston Comical. And you'll see why I say that in just a minute. It says two Houston universities are listed among the worst campuses for LGBTQ students. Only one, Bayou University, made a national list of LGBTQ-friendly campuses, and this is written by Ariana Garcia, October 26, 2021. And this particular article by the Chronicle targets two universities that are near and dear to my heart. One of them is nearby Houston Baptist University, because we have an awful lot of college students and young people from our church that attend that particular institution. And the other one is a school that I was privileged to work at for 7 years, the College of Biblical Studies, where I was a full-time professor of Bible and theology. And now this article from the Chronicle indicates that these two schools are fundamentally unsafe for all students to go to. Why is that? Because they promote an environment of hostility, of discrimination, and harassment. Don't send your students to the College of Biblical Studies in Houston, and don't send them to Houston Baptist University, because according to the Houston Chronicle, these schools are fundamentally unsafe for students to go to. They're not just unsafe for LGBTQ students, they're unsafe for all students. Why is that? Because they promote an environment of hostility and discrimination and harassment. Now, why does the Houston Chronicle say something like that? They say it because this particular writer doesn't like the fact that these two schools take a stand. By the way, it's not a unique stand. It goes back 2,000 years to the Bible. Christians have always taken this stand, that take the Bible seriously. They take a stand on the issue of homosexuality. Love the sinner, hate the sin. We don't endorse homosexual unions. We believe that God's pattern for sexuality is one man for one woman for one life, heterosexual monogamy. The grace of God is available for anyone that breaks God's standard, but that doesn't change the fact that there's a standard. The College of Biblical Studies has a wonderful statement on this. They say, consistent with our mission of providing biblically based education, the College of Biblical Studies embraces the Bible as the authoritative source of all beliefs about human sexuality. The Bible portrays human sexuality as a gift given by God to the first married couple, originally biologically created as male and female, to unite them for the purpose of pleasure and procreation to the glory of God. Genesis 1:27 and 28, Genesis 2:24, Matthew 19, verse 5. Houston Baptist University has a very similar statement. They say, marriage is the uniting of one man and one woman in covenant commitment for a lifetime. It is God's unique gift to reveal the union between Christ and His church and to provide for the man and the woman in marriage in the framework for intimate companionship, the channel for sexual expression according to biblical standards, and the means for procreation of the human race. That's Houston Baptist University position statement on the family, and the former one that I read is the College of Biblical Studies biblical statement on human sexuality. In other words, these schools are just standing for what the Bible says. And now the Houston Chronicle comes along and says these schools are unsafe. They promote an environment of hostility, discrimination, and harassment, not only for LGBTQ students, but they're very clear, the Houston Chronicle is for all students. And I like very much this response by Dave Welch. I think he's head of an organization called HPAC, if I have that right. And he wrote in his recent blog article something entitled "Christian Universities Unsafe Because They Follow Their Faith?" ? And he calls out this Houston Chronicle reporter, Ariana Garcia, on her sources. Apparently, Garcia of the Chronicle draws the entire content for her article from a radical LGBTQIAP+. I have to be honest with you folks, as I read all of these initials and letters, I don't even know what the last half of them mean anymore. But apparently it's an organization for campus pride whose mission is to develop, support, and give voice and action in building future LGBTQ student leaders. So the Houston Chronicle, when it developed this article, used that group, a radical group, as its source. Gee, that sure is ethical journalism, isn't it? Anybody knows in journalism that you have to use multiple sources. You don't just pick one source that favors one side of the issue and develop your whole article around it. And that's what the Houston Chronicle did, as it targeted these two schools, HBU and CBS, which are wonderful schools, by the way, simply because they take a stand on this issue of sexuality based on the Bible. Beyond that, as a professor at the College of Biblical Studies for 7 years, working full-time as a teacher in the Bible and theology departments, I can testify personally that this idea that the College of Biblical Studies is physically unsafe for all students is an idea that's absurd. It's ridiculous. In fact, the College of Biblical Studies that I have direct experience with has bent over backwards. I mean, I've been to countless faculty meetings, administrative meetings discussing this subject. They have bent over backwards to make that school a safe and healthy environment for anybody that wants to come and participate in their curriculum. So this idea that it's somehow unsafe, I mean, do you have some crime statistics or something that you can use to back that up? Well, of course not. All we have is this one-sided report drawing from its sources or source from a one-sided group and tarring and feathering two institutions because they simply stand on what the Bible has taught and what Christians have believed for 2,000 years. I very much like how Dave Welch concludes his own piece critiquing the Chronicle. He says this: sexual predators, such as the young man declaring himself female and sexually assaulting two girls in Loudoun County, Virginia, are the fruits of the LGBTQIAP plus agenda. You want to talk about unsafe? You want to talk about an environment that's unsafe for all students? How about this? A young man who happens to think on that particular day he's a girl, and he goes into the girls' locker room and he ends up raping somebody. And you're gonna turn around and you're gonna accuse us as Bible believers of creating an unsafe environment when your own house is not even in order? And by the way, as we're filming this, we're in the wake of the governor's Virginia race, where a Democratic governor in a very blue state, Virginia, Loudoun County, Virginia, which is the home of Loudoun County, Virginia, was just removed from power on this issue, where they acted like this rape was, they just kind of glossed over it. And so this is an issue that is, it's touching people. People are rising up against what this LGBTQIAP plus agenda really is. And my point is, if you want to talk about campus safety, your own campus isn't safe. When a young man can put on a dress and pretend he's a girl and go into the women's or girls' locker room and rape somebody, and you people want to lecture the rest of us about campus safety. And I bring this up because this is the kind of thing that is happening all over our country and all over our world, where simply standing on biblical norms, you're being tarred and feathered as producing an unsafe environment, which is factually absurd and it's factually ridiculous. And you ask yourself, whatever happened to the United States Constitution that's supposed to protect freedom of expression, freedom of religion? I mean, when did it suddenly become criminal to simply have a school that wants to defend the biblical view of sexuality? And the whole argument, as I've tried to demonstrate, is patently absurd on its face. And I need to stop here because I'm getting myself worked up. So, prophecy update, things going on in the culture war. In these two sessions, we've looked at Israel, the New World Order religion, where Christianity is being used to argue for the progressive agenda, the New World Order location in the Middle East, global crisis management through ever-increasing emphasis on anthropogenic climate change, the tech tyranny we're under. And in this particular episode, we dealt with the gender surrender, our transition into a Marxist economy, the possibility or probability of the coming of re-education camps, and our vanishing Constitution. But as we like to say, we like to end with a word of hope. Things are not falling apart. They're falling into place, aren't they? Because this is what God said would happen at the end of the age. So our hope is in Titus 2:13, chapter 2, verse 13, which is looking for the blessed hope and the appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. That's our hope, folks. Jesus is coming back soon to rescue us from this world. And as we live here, let's not be in denial. Let's embrace reality, but let's also understand that soon and very soon, there's a better world coming. A few concluding announcements. My book on Babylon is out, called Babylon, The Bookends of Prophetic History. You can find that at dispensationalpublishing.com and also on Amazon. I hope you'll track with us also on Wednesday evenings as we're continuing our verse-by-verse study through the prophet Zechariah here at Sugarland Bible Church. We're also happy that our pastor's point of view programs are now available in podcast format. So we are available on Spotify, Podcast Addict, Pocket Cast, Listen Notes, Podcast Index, Amazon Music, Podchasers, Chaser, Deezer, Player FM, RSS feed, and of course also on Apple. So just get the app, Apple Podcasts, I think it's called, and search for Andy Woods or Pastor's Point of View, Andy Woods, in your search engine, and we'll come right up there. Also, I would encourage you to take advantage of Amazon Smile, where you can use that particular option on Amazon, and you can actually help Andy Woods Ministries. I would encourage you to go back and listen to a couple of shows before this one to get the details on that. I would also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Go to andywoodsministries.org, and on the homepage there's a way to sign up for our newsletter, where every time we post a Pastor's Point of View show, these show notes that we're using, giving you our sources, will show up in your inbox for you to do further research and take a look at our links, just to determine that our sources are in fact valid. This presentation is going to be uploaded onto YouTube, so just type in the Andy Woods into your YouTube search engine, and do us a favor, sign up for a free subscription to our YouTube channel, the Andy Woods Ministries YouTube channel, and click on that bell to be notified of everything we upload. We upload stuff there, I think 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week. We are also available on Parler. And if there's anything that I forgot to mention, I apologize. Just a lot of things to get to at the end. But just encourage you to really keep the Lord first and foremost on your thoughts as we now move into November and December, and we celebrate Thanksgiving, and we get into the Christmas season, and remember that He is the reason for this season. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. God bless you.